everyone. So, I'll be discussing the impact of technology on youth and families from the scope of human development and a cross cultural analysis. Here's an overview of what I'll be discussing. I'll be going over my developmental question, some research, my developmental analysis. I will then examine and apply this to the clinical practice as well as any personal connections. So, firstly, developmental question. Does an increase of quote unquote screen time lead to more deficiencies within a child's development? If so, what kind? My own hypothesis is that with the assumption that a child spends less time engaging within their environment when on a personal device, they will therefore face difficulty developing socially and emotionally. Here's the research portion. This is a following this slide is a chart of what I call fundamentals. This is a general understanding of technology with children in the family unit based off of the research that I've seen, specifically within the familial microsystem. Disclaimer: this does not include other relationships such as school, peers, teachers, community, etc. So, from what I personally know, and this also counts towards my personal connection, which I'll later discuss at the end, this is a flowchart of how I've conceptualized technology within the family unit and within child development. So, the fundamentals of development include a child within a family and their caregivers as that formative portion of their microsystem. But when technology gets tossed into the mix of it, we see, a child with a possible technological dependency, which distracts them from family, peers, and social development, but also distracts them from cognitive, emotional, and sometimes academic development, as it can be a distraction. And therefore, they have a lack of attachment to their own growth and development. This is also seen through the fact that they have a lack of attachment to the things in their environment which encourage growth. And on the other end of that, when we toss in technological dependency as a possibility with family and caregivers, I mean, their rudimentary, almost existence for a child is to be a role model of what development looks like and what is to come for them, whether it be older siblings or adults. They are also the main source of attachment, care, and attention. So when they're distracted from holding these expectations of development and being a role model, we're seeing a disconnect between the child and development as a whole, as their role model is distracted from being said role model. On the other end of it, being the source of attachment, care, and so on, when technology is tossed into it, we see a distraction from providing attention and being present with the child, showing up for them emotionally and socially. So, with that being said, I'd like to go into the relationship between COVID 19, technology, and social development. Younger generations are having a harder time socializing. I feel like that's a generalized assumption for most of us, and that was reflected in a study with Turner and in their Generation Z technology and social interest study. COVID 19 was a very big contributor to this, as technology was our biggest asset to the work environment, school, entertainment, and sometimes social interactions. This has changed the way that kids go about social and academic lives. It was found that 61.7% of increase within smartphone usage amongst children below the age of 18. With that being said, neurological development was of most concern within Limon and Toto's study regarding psychological and emotional effects of digital technology on children within the COVID 19 pandemic. They described that neuroplasticity was altered when children used technology for prolonged periods of time. Um, as some of us already understand it, neural pathways are altered when technology is tossed into it because children are developing these pathways at a much faster rate than adults are. With that in mind, it should be acknowledged that technology dependency has effects on children and overall development. Some teens prefer losing their allowance money or having video games taken away as punishment than have their personal device taken away. Now, social media and technology have created harmful relationships with youth as it portrays false ideals of life, lifestyles, health, and so on. And with that even said, we see this across all ages as social media has become a part of our daily lives. Um, Again, with Limon and Toto, their 2021 study also considers that because of the relationship with technology, youth, and COVID 19, that we're seeing an epidemic of addiction with technology for youth. And as we generally understand the word addiction, it's something that comes from, bringing joy and happiness to then creating harm on oneself, peers, family, work, school, etc., and interfering with what was once healthy interactions. Um, but there are positive aspects, but it depends on the use of technology. Is it being used for work? Is it being used for academics? Is it being used socially, such as video games or Twitch, things like that? Next, something I like to bring up is in regards to families, technology, and social development. So, what's called home care should include less technology within children as they are forced to experience and learn from their environments and family. From what we have learned regarding early development within childcare or child development is they will, when they are forced to interact with their environment, they are more curious. They are trying to explore and figure out how things work in their environment. So, with a lack of environmental exploration, this can lead to poor social skills later in life and can be a detriment on their timeline of social growth. So, what this can be an example of strangers that have a hard time asking a store clerk for help or trying to ask for directions. Granted, nobody does that anymore, but this sense of having technology in the home in a child's everyday life as they interact socially, this can create a rift in familial relationships, similar to the flowchart earlier, where family is distracted, caregivers are distracted, and this creates a big sense of disconnect and can bring long-term effects to these relationships. Things like being able to trust a family member because they are either socially and emotionally present or not. Families aren't having enough quote unquote unplugged time, according to Wang and Bernard from their 2004 study. And parents aren't leading by example in the regard of healthy, balanced lifestyles. They too are engaged in their technology so much that it's taking away from the development of their young ones. Next is the aspect of school and technology and social development. There's a study called One Laptop Per Child program that gave over 902,000 laptops throughout the Latin American region to students for academic use. And the parameters included ages 6 to 12. The students had to be solely responsible for their laptops. They referred to it as them being the owners of their laptops. Every child and teacher receives a laptop. Everyone is connected to the internet and Wi Fi. And lastly, software is completely open source and free. The goal was they wanted to see if students were being held accountable for their learning and honestly having more respect for their learning and academic success. but also hoping to see more of an interconnection with their school peers. And their methodology um, was to measure changes of GPA as well as behavioral aspects that they analyzed, in which they call enrollment, attendance, study at home, and reading habits. Um, in a nutshell, their results concluded that there was an increased computer use of 82%, which was pretty obvious. There was an influx of enrollment due to technological advances at the schools, and in a way, they saw it as more of a curb appeal type of um, type of influx of enrollment, just because it made the schools look more advanced and funded in that way. Um, the only area that excelled amongst students was in regards to self esteem related to school performance, though their grades remain the same. So, in parentheses, I said, this is a false sense of success in some cases. They were correct in hoping that students would be held more accountable and more responsible for their academic success. But this holds more of students thought that they were excelling because they had a laptop rather than the fact that their grades stayed the same despite having a laptop. As previously mentioned, COVID 19 reminded us how powerful technology is and aided us in connecting with work, school, our neighbors, and so on. And with the increase of technologies in school, this has created no change in academic success, but a deficiency in social relationships, according to Limon and Toto. And lastly, within that same study, they found that technology aids children in learning, but reflects the impact it had during the pandemic lockdown. So that last bullet is more pertaining to the fact that we needed technology for academic success for our kids, but it's because we are leaning out of these COVID expectations and parameters that students are not using it for the same reasons anymore. It was formative to have every student online to access their schooling, but now it's not as necessary anymore. So, here are some other cultural considerations I'd like to add in relation to technological use. So, the first I found, according to a later study, is physical health. Medical context and physical activity can contribute to the use of technology. Economic status. This one's pretty self explanatory, but this does vary. It varies amongst all races, genders, and levels of education pertaining to families and caregivers. And the access of technology increases with income because we're seeing more households with a home computer or kids having tablets at home, having phones, things like that. And the last one, kind of, it goes hand in hand with economic status, and that is access to education pertaining to the child. So, are they homeschooled, public school, or in private school? This directly relates to the funding of said school or the school district. So here's a brief video that describes the neurological effects of technology on developing minds. It's important to be mindful regarding the relationship between the neurological, the cognitive, and social emotional development of a child, in which all areas have a relationship with each other.
As more young people like David hole up in their rooms with their devices, studies show a generation delaying adulthood. Fewer get driver's licenses, have after school jobs, or date. But most alarming, the suicide rate for girls ages 15 to 19 doubled between 2007 and 2015. Dr. Larry Rosen, a leading psychologist, is especially concerned about what all this tech is doing to developing brains.
We know what the blue light does to their brain. Night after night, it leaves these little molecules called beta amyloids, and they build into plaques. And when they look at the brains of Alzheimer's patients, they have a lot of plaque in their brains. And I think that we're heading toward a major problem as these kids who've been using phones for the last 10 years start to get into their 20s, 30s, and 40s. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of memory problems coming up.
Wow, that's pretty scary. Tech is not only affecting our brains, it's also affecting our creativity.
When you are being creative, or your mind is wandering, or you're dreaming or daydreaming, a different part of your brain is activated. Part of what we're doing to ourselves as well as our kids is that we're not allowing enough of that time, because it's so easy to just pull out your phone and check the news or whatever. It doesn't matter. It stifles your ability to live within boredom. And boredom is important because boredom then clicks in the creative activities. We don't allow ourselves to get bored anymore.
Want more exclusive content from America Inside Out? Well, just click one of these videos.
All right, so that brings me into my developmental analysis. Just to recap, my developmental question is, does an increase of screen time lead to more deficiencies within a child's development? If so, what kind? And I hypothesized that with the assumption that a child spends less time engaging within their environment when on a personal device, they will therefore face difficulty developing socially and emotionally. So, overall, though technology has connected students, kids, families throughout COVID 19 and connected them to new and exciting ways to learn, there are aspects to consider. They are disconnected from their surroundings, which is detrimental towards their environmental development and exploration. Their personal devices are used before bed, which can cause sleeping problems, leads to poor performance at school, lack of focus, mood fluctuations, etc. And just like the previous video, it was mentioned that it can lead to memory problems in a longitudinal way. And lastly, this withholds attention span from school and youth program activities and desensitizes them in that regard. Aspects of learning just aren't fun anymore due to this accessibility of information on the internet and constantly being able to just plug onto your phone and be engaged with something when you're bored. All right, here is the clinical application portion of my research. So, with an increased use of technology within children and families, it has an overall negative effect on development as a whole. I hope to use this information to aid families to understand that an increase of tech use equals to less meaningful relationships for children and detrimental of their own emotional and social development. In order to aid in the use of technology with children, I hope it reflects positively at school and at home in the sense that, again, technology is great when it's used in certain aspects of life. Um, just like Limon and Toto's study in 2021, technology was being used in a way that we needed it back then during the pandemic and during lockdown. We needed to log on to school, we needed to log on for work. But when it became excessive for personal use, that's when it has a bit more of a negative effect on us. Next, an increase in teen growth. I hope to use this information and this position of what technology can have for families and children in the sense to increase teen growth towards driving and positive social and emotional growth and exploration of relationships and lead them positively into young adulthood. And lastly, I hope to encourage social development as a positive attribute for being quote unquote unplugged. Here's my personal connection to finish everything and tie everything together. So, my background is working with youth and families, and I have seen the social change that is with said populations pre and post pandemic. So, um, we've seen the most participation within the Boys and Girls Club of Las Cruces, but only when it's related to computer use, when it's not even related to academics. Next is when they aren't on their computers, they are on their personal devices or other devices, which prevent them from being the most involved. Next is teen participation. We don't see as much engagement with our teens as they are always on their personal devices, and this pulls them away from social centered activities with their peers. And lastly, because entertainment is so accessible 24/7 for kids with their own devices, it completely desensitizes them to regular play and organic interactions. All right, here are the rest of my references, and thank you so much, everybody.